Miss Honey's Story. Miss Honey's Story. We mustn't hurry this, Miss Honey said, so let's have another cup of tea. And do eat that other slice of bread. You must be hungry. Matilda took the second slice and started eating it slowly. The margarine wasn't at all bad. She doubted whether she could have told the difference if she hadn't known. Miss Honey, she said suddenly, do they pay you very badly at our school? Miss Honey looked up sharply. Not too badly, she said. I get about the same as the others. But it must still be very little if you are so dreadfully poor, Matilda said. Do all the teachers live like this, with no furniture, and no kitchen stove, and no bathroom? No, they don't, Miss Honey said, rather stiffly. I just happen to be the exception. I expect you just happen to like living in a very simple way, Matilda said, probing a little further. It must make house cleaning an awful lot easier, and you don't have furniture to polish or any of those silly little ornaments lying around that have to be dusted every day. And I suppose if you don't have a fridge, you don't have to go out and buy all sorts of junky things like eggs and mayonnaise and ice cream to fill it up with. It must save a terrific lot of shopping. At this point, Matilda noticed that Miss Honey's face had gone all tight and peculiar looking. Her whole body had become rigid. Her shoulders were hunched up high and her lips were pressed together tight, and she sat there gripping her mug of tea in both hands and staring down into it as though searching for a way to answer these not quite so innocent questions. There followed a rather long and embarrassing silence. In the space of 30 seconds, the atmosphere in the tiny room had changed completely, and now it was vibrating with awkwardness and secrets. Matilda said, I'm very sorry I asked you those questions, Miss Honey. It is not any of my business. At this, Miss Honey seemed to rouse herself. She gave a shake of her shoulders, and then very carefully she placed her mug on the tray. Why shouldn't you ask? She said. You are bound to ask in the end. You are much too bright not to have wondered. Perhaps I even wanted you to ask. Maybe that is why I invited you here after all. As a matter of fact, you are the first visitor to come to the cottage since I moved in 2 years ago. Matilda said nothing. She could feel the tension growing and growing in the room. You are so much wiser than your years, my dear, Miss Honey went on, that it quite staggers me. Although you look like a child, you are not really a child at all because your mind and your powers of reasoning seem to be fully grown up. So I suppose we might call you a grown-up child, if you see what I mean. Matilda still did not say anything. She was waiting for what was coming next. Up to now, Miss Honey went on, I have found it impossible to talk to anyone about my problems. I couldn't face the embarrassment. And anyway, I lacked the courage. Any courage I had was knocked out of me when I was young. But now, all of a sudden, I have a sort of desperate wish to tell everything to somebody. I know you are only a tiny little girl, but there is some kind of magic in you somewhere. I've seen it with my own eyes. Matilda became very alert. The voice she was hearing was surely crying out for help. It must be. It had to be. Then the voice spoke again. Have some more tea, it said. I think there's still a drop left. Matilda nodded. Miss Honey poured tea into both mugs and added milk. Again she cupped her own mug in both hands and sat there sipping. There was quite a long silence before she said, May I tell you a story? Of course, Matilda said. I am 23 years old, Miss Honey said, and when I was born my father was a doctor in this village. We had a nice old house, quite large, red brick. It tucked away in the woods behind the hills. I don't think you'd know it. Matilda kept silent. I was born there, Miss Honey said, and then came the first tragedy. My mother died when I was 2. My father, a busy doctor, had to have someone to run the house and to look after me, so he invited my mother's unmarried sister, my aunt, to come and live with us. She agreed, and she came. Matilda was listening intently. How old was the aunt when she moved in? She asked. Not very old, Miss Honey said. I should say about 30. But I hated her right from the start. I missed my mother terribly, and the aunt was not a kind person. My father didn't know that because he was hardly ever around, but when he did put in an appearance, the aunt behaved differently. Miss Honey paused and sipped her tea. I can't think why I'm telling you all this, she said, embarrassed. Go on, Matilda said. Please. Well, Miss Honey said, then came the second tragedy. When I was 5, my father died very suddenly. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. And so I was left to live alone with my aunt. She became my legal guardian. She had all the powers of a parent over me, and in some way or another, she became the actual owner of the house. How did your father die? Matilda asked. It is interesting you should ask that, Miss Honey said. I myself was much too young to question it at the time, but I found out later that there was a good deal of mystery surrounding his death. Didn't they know how he died? Matilda asked. Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, hesitating. You see, no one could believe that he would ever have done it. He was such a very sane and sensible man. Done what? Matilda asked. Killed himself. Matilda was stunned. Did he? She gasped. That's what it looked like, Miss Honey said. But who knows? She shrugged and turned away and stared out of the tiny window. I know what you're thinking, Matilda said. You're thinking that the aunt killed him and made it look as though he'd done it himself. I'm not thinking anything, Miss Honey said. One must never think things like that without proof. The little room became quiet. Matilda noticed that the hands clasping the mug were trembling slightly. What happened after that? She asked. What happened when you were left all alone with the aunt? Wasn't she nice to you? Nice? Miss Honey said. She was a demon. As soon as my father was out of the way, she became a holy terror. My life was a nightmare. What did she do to you? Matilda asked. I don't want to talk about it, Miss Honey said. It's too horrible. But in the end, I became so frightened of her, I used to start shaking when she came into the room. You must understand, I was never a strong character like you. I was always shy and retiring. Didn't you have any other relations? Matilda asked. Any uncles or aunts or grannies who could come and see you? None that I knew about, Miss Honey said. They were all either dead or they'd gone to Australia. And that's still the way it is now, I'm afraid. So you grew up in that house alone with your aunt? Matilda said. But you must have gone to school. Of course, Miss Honey said. I went to the same school you're going to now, but I lived at home. Miss Honey paused and stared down into her empty tea mug. I think that I'm trying to explain to you, she said, is that over the years I became so completely cowed and dominated by this monster of an aunt that when she gave me an order, no matter what it was, I obeyed it instantly. That can happen, you know. And by the time I was 10, I had become her slave. I did all her housework. I made her bed. I washed and ironed for her. I did all the cooking. I learned how to do everything. But surely you could have complained to somebody, Matilda said. To whom? Miss Honey said. And anyway, I was far too terrified to complain. I told you I was her slave. Did she beat you? Let's not go into details, Miss Honey said. How simply awful, Matilda said. Did you cry nearly all the time? Only when I was alone, Miss Honey said. I wasn't allowed to cry in front of her, but I lived in fear. What happened when you left school? Matilda asked. I was a bright pupil, Miss Honey said. I could easily have gone into university, but there was no question of that. Why not, Miss Honey? Because I was needed at home to do the work. Then how'd you become a teacher? Matilda asked. There is a teacher's training college in Reading, Miss Honey said. That's only 40 minutes bus ride away from here. I was allowed to go there on condition I came straight home again every afternoon to do the washing and ironing and to clean the house and cook the supper. How old were you then? Matilda asked. When I went into teacher training, I was 18, Miss Honey said. You could have just packed up and walked away, Matilda said. Not until I got a job, Miss Honey said. And don't forget, I was by then dominated by my aunt to such an extent that I wouldn't have dared. You can't imagine what it's like to be completely controlled like that by a very strong personality, it turns you to jelly. So that's it. That's the whole sad story of my life. Now I've talked enough. Please don't stop, Matilda said. You haven't finished yet. How did you manage to get away from her in the end and come and live in this funny little house? Ah, that was something, Miss Honey said. I was proud of that. Tell me, Matilda said. Well, Miss Honey said, when I got my teacher's job, the aunt told me I owed her a lot of money. I asked her why. She said, because I'd been feeding you for all these years and buying your shoes and your clothes. She told me it added up to thousands, and I had to pay her back by giving her my salary for the next 10 years. I'll give you £1 a week, pocket money, she said, but that's all you're going to get. She even arranged with the school authorities to have my salary paid directly into her own bank. She made me sign the paper. You shouldn't have done that, Matilda said. Your salary was your chance of freedom. I know, Miss Honey said. But by then I had been her slave nearly all my life, and I hadn't the courage or the guts to say no. I was still petrified of her. She could still hurt me badly. So how did you manage to escape? Matilda asked. Ah, Miss Honey said, smiling for the first time. That was 2 years ago. It was my greatest triumph. Please tell me, Matilda said. I used to get up very early and go for walks while my aunt was still asleep, Miss Honey said, and one day I came across this tiny cottage. It was empty. I found out who owned it. It was a farmer. I went to see him. Farmers always get up so very early. He was milking his cows. I asked him if I could rent his cottage. You can't live there, he cried. It's got no conveniences, no running water, no nothing. I want to live there, I said. I'm a romantic. I've fallen in love with it. Please rent it to me. You're mad, he said. But if you insist, you're welcome to it. The rent will be 10 pence a week. Here's 1 month rent in advance, I said, giving him 40 pence, and thank you so much. How super, Matilda cried. So suddenly you had a house all of your own. But how did you pluck up the courage to tell the aunt? That was tough, Miss Honey said, but I steeled myself to do it. One night after I had cooked her supper, I went upstairs and packed the few things I possessed in a cardboard box and came downstairs and announced I was leaving. I've rented a house, I said. My aunt exploded. Rented a house? She shouted. How can you rent a house when you have £1 a week in the world? I've done it, I said. And how are you going to buy food for yourself? I'll manage, I mumbled and rushed out of the front door. Oh, well done you, Matilda cried. So you were free at last? I was free at last, Miss Honey said. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. But have you really managed to live here on £1 a week for 2 years? Matilda asked. I most certainly have, Miss Honey said. I pay 10 pence rent, and the rest just about buys me paraffin for my stove and for my lamp and a little milk and tea and bread and margarine. That's all I need, really. As I told you, I have a jolly good tuck-in at the school lunch. Matilda stared at her. What a marvelously brave thing Miss Honey had done. Suddenly, she was a heroine in Matilda's eyes. Isn't it awfully cold in the winter? She asked. I've got my little paraffin stove, Miss Honey said. You'd be surprised how snug I can make it in here. Do you have a bed, Miss Honey? Well, not exactly, Miss Honey said, smiling again. But they say it's very healthy to sleep on a hard surface. All at once, Matilda was able to see the whole situation with absolute clarity. Miss Honey needed help. There was no way she could go on existing like this indefinitely. You would be a lot better off, Miss Honey, she said, if you gave up your job and drew unemployment money. I would never do that, Miss Honey said. I love teaching. This awful aunt, Matilda said. I suppose she is still living in your lovely old house. Very much so, Miss Honey said. She's still only about 50. She'll be around for a very long time yet. And do you think your father really meant her to own the house forever? I'm quite sure he didn't, Miss Honey said. Parents will often give a guardian the right to occupy the house for a certain length of time, but it's nearly always left in trust for the child. It then becomes the child's property when he or she grows up. Then surely it is your house, Matilda said. My father's will was never found, Miss Honey said. It looks as though somebody destroyed it. No prizes for guessing who, Matilda said. No prizes, Miss Honey said. But if there's no will, Miss Honey, then surely the house goes automatically to you. You are the next of kin. I know I am, Miss Honey said, but my aunt produced a piece of paper supposedly written by my father saying that he leaves the house to his sister-in-law in return for her kindness in looking after me. I am certain it's a forgery, but no one can prove it. Couldn't you try? Matilda said. Couldn't you hire a good lawyer and make a fight of it? I don't have the money to do that, Miss Honey said, and you must remember that this aunt of mine is a much respected figure in the community. She has a lot of influence. Who is she? Matilda asked. Miss Honey hesitated a moment. Then she said softly, Miss Trunchbull. The names. Miss Trunchbull, Matilda cried, jumping about a foot in the air. You mean she is your aunt? She brought you up? Yes, Miss Honey said. No wonder you were terrified, Matilda cried. The other day we saw her grab a girl by the pigtails and throw her over the playground fence. You haven't seen anything, Miss Honey said. After my father died when I was 5 and a half, she used to make me bathe. Used to make me bath myself all alone. And if she came up and thought I hadn't washed properly, she would push my head under the water and hold it there. But don't get me started on what she used to do. That won't help us at all. No, Matilda said, it won't. We came here, Miss Honey said, to talk about you, and I've been talking about nothing but myself the whole time. I feel like a fool. I am much more interested in just how much you can do with those amazing eyes of yours. I can move things, Matilda said. I know I can. I can push things over. How would you like it, Miss Honey said, if we made some very cautious experiments to see just how much you can move and push? Quite surprisingly, Matilda said. If you don't mind, Miss Honey, I think I would rather not. I want to go home now and think about all the things I've heard this afternoon. Miss Honey stood up at once. Of course, she said. I have kept you here far too long. Your mother will be starting to worry. She never does that, Matilda said, smiling. But I would like to go home now, please, if you don't mind. Come along then, Miss Honey said. I'm sorry I gave you such a rotten tea. You didn't at all, Matilda said. I loved it. The two of them walked all the way to Matilda's house in complete silence. Miss Honey sensed that Matilda wanted it that way. The child seemed so lost in thought she hardly looked where she was walking, and when she reached the gate of Matilda's home, Miss Honey said, You had better forget everything I told you this afternoon. I won't promise to do that, Matilda said, but I will promise not to talk about it to anyone any more, not even to you. I think that would be wise, Miss Honey said. I won't promise to stop thinking about it, though, Miss Honey, Matilda said. I've been thinking about it all the way back from your cottage, and I believe I've got a tiny little bit of an idea. You mustn't, Miss Honey said. Please forget it. I would like to ask you 3 last things before I stop talking about it, Matilda said. Please will you answer them, Miss Honey? Miss Honey smiled. It was extraordinary, she told herself, how this little snippet of a girl seemed suddenly to be taking charge of her problems, and with such authority, too. Well, she said, that depends on what the questions are. The first thing is, Matilda said, what did Miss Trunchbull call your father when they were around the house at home? I'm sure he called him Magnus, Miss Honey said. That was his first name. And what did your father call Miss Trunchbull? Her name is Agatha, Miss Honey said. That's what he would have called her. And lastly, Matilda said, what did your father and Miss Trunchbull call you around the house? They called me Jenny, Miss Honey said. Matilda pondered these answers very carefully. Let me make sure I've got them right, she said. In the house at home, your father was Magnus. Miss Trunchbull was Agatha, and you were Jenny. Am I right? That is correct, Miss Honey said. Thank you, Matilda said. And now I won't mention the subject any more. Miss Honey wondered what on earth was going on in the mind of this child. Don't do anything silly, she said. Matilda laughed and turned away and ran up the path to the front door, calling out as she went, Goodbye, Miss Honey. Thank you so much for the tea. The practice. Matilda found the house empty as usual. Her father was not yet back from work, her mother was not yet back from bingo, and her brother might be anywhere. She went straight into the living room and opened the drawer of the sideboard where she knew her father kept a box of cigars. She took one out and carried it up to her bedroom and shut herself in. Now for the practice, she told herself. It's going to be tough, but I'm determined to do it. Her plan for helping Miss Honey was beginning to form beautifully in her mind. She had it now in almost every detail, but in the end it all depended upon her being able to do one very special thing with her eye power. She knew she wouldn't manage it right away, but she felt fairly confident that with a great deal of practice and effort she would succeed in the end. The cigar was essential. It was perhaps a bit thicker than she would have liked, but the weight was just about right. It would be fine for practicing with. There was a small dressing table in Matilda's bedroom with her hairbrush and comb on it and 2 library books. She cleared these things to one side and laid the cigar down in the middle of the dressing table. Then she walked away and sat on the end of her bed. She was now about 10 feet from the cigar. She settled herself and began to concentrate, and very quickly, this time, she felt the electricity beginning to flow inside her head, gathering itself behind the eyes. And the eyes became hot, and millions of tiny invisible hands began pushing out like sparks towards the cigar. "Move," she whispered. And to her intense surprise, almost at once, the cigar with its little red and gold paper band around its middle rolled away across the top of the dressing table and fell on the carpet. Matilda had enjoyed that. It was lovely doing it. It had felt as though the sparks were going around and round inside her head and flashing out of her eyes. It had given her a sense of power that was almost ethereal. And how quick it had been this time. How simple. She crossed the bedroom and picked up the cigar and put it back on the table. Now for the difficult one, she thought. But if I have the power to push, then surely I also have the power to lift. It is vital I learn how to lift. I must learn how to lift it right up in the air and keep it there. It is not a very heavy cigar. It is not a very heavy thing, a cigar. She sat on the end of the bed and started again. It was easy now to summon up the power behind her eyes. It was like pushing a trigger in the brain. "Lift," she whispered. "Lift, lift." At first the cigar started to roll away, but then, with Matilda concentrating fiercely, one end of it slowly lifted about an inch off the table. With a colossal effort, she managed to hold it there for about 10 seconds. Then it fell back again. "Phew!" she gasped. "I'm getting it. I'm starting to do it." For the next hour, Matilda kept practicing, and in the end, she had managed by sheer power of her eyes to lift the whole cigar clear off the table about 6 inches into the air and hold it there for about a minute. Then suddenly she was so exhausted she fell back on the bed and went to sleep. That was how her mother found her later in the evening. "What's the matter with you?" the mother asked, waking her up. "Are you ill?" "Oh, gosh," Matilda said, sitting up and looking around. "No, I'm all right. I'm a bit tired, that's all." From then on, every day after school, Matilda shut herself in her room and practiced with the cigar. And soon it all began to come together in the most wonderful way. 6 days later, by the following Wednesday evening, she was able not only to lift the cigar up into the air, but also to move it around exactly as she wished. It was beautiful. "I can do it," she cried. "I can really do it. I can pick the cigar up just with my eye power and push it and pull it in the air any way I want." All she had to do now was to put her great plan into action. The third miracle. The next day was Thursday, and that, as the whole of Miss Honey's class knew, was the day on which the head mistress would take charge of the first lesson after lunch. In the morning, Miss Honey said to them, "One or two of you did not particularly enjoy the last occasion when the head mistress took the class, so let us all try to be especially careful and clever today. How are your ears, Eric, after your last encounter with Miss Trunchbull?" "She stretched them," Eric said. "My mother said she's positive they are bigger than they were." "And Rupert?" Miss Honey said. I'm glad to see you didn't lose any of your hair after last Thursday. My head was jolly sore afterwards, Rupert said. And you, Nigel, Miss Honey said. Do please try not to be smart aleck with the headmistress today. You were really quite cheeky to her last week. I hate her, Nigel said. Try not to make it so obvious, Miss Honey said. It doesn't pay. She's a very strong woman. She has muscles like steel ropes. I wish I was grown up, Nigel said. I'd knock her flat. I doubt you would, Miss Honey said. No one has ever got the better of her yet. What will she be testing us on this afternoon? A small girl asked. Almost certainly the 3 times tables, Miss Honey said. That's what you were all meant to have learnt this past week. Make sure you know it. Lunch came and went. After lunch, the class reassembled. Miss Honey stood at one side of the room. They all sat silent, apprehensive, waiting. And then, like some giant of doom, the enormous Trunchbull strode into the room in her green breeches and cotton smock. She went straight to her jug of water and lifted it up by the handle and peered inside. I'm glad to see, she said, that there are no slimy creatures in my drinking water this time. If there had been, then something exceptionally unpleasant would have happened to every single member of this class, and that includes you, Miss Honey. The class remained silent and very tense. They had learnt a bit about this tigress by now, and nobody was about to take any chances. Very well, boomed the Trunchbull. Let's see how well you know your 3 times table. Or to put it another way, let us see how badly Miss Honey has taught you the 3 times table. The Trunchbull was standing in front of the class, legs apart, hands on hips, scowling at Miss Honey, who stood silent to one side. Matilda, sitting motionless at her desk in the second row, was watching things very closely. You! The Trunchbull shouted, pointing a finger the size of a rolling pin at a boy called Wilfred. Wilfred was on the extreme right of the front row. Stand up! You! She shouted at him. Wilfred stood up. Recite the 3 times table backwards, the Trunchbull barked. Backwards? Stammered Wilfred. But I haven't learned it backwards. There you are, cried the Trunchbull, triumphant. She's taught you nothing. Miss Honey, why have you taught them absolutely nothing at all in the last week? That's not true, headmistress, Miss Honey said. They have all learnt their 3 times table, but I see no point in teaching it to them backwards. There is little point in teaching anything backwards. The whole object of life, headmistress, is to go forwards. I venture to ask whether even you, for example, can spell a simple word like wrong backwards straight away. I very much doubt it. Don't you impertinent with me, Miss Honey, the Trunchbull snapped. Then she turned back to the unfortunate Wilfred. Very well, boy, she said. Answer me this. I have 7 apples, 7 oranges, and 7 bananas. How many pieces of fruit do I have altogether? Hurry up, get on with it. Give me the answer. That's adding up, Wilfred cried. That isn't the 3 times table. You blithering idiot, shouted the Trunchbull. You festering gumboil, you flea-bitten fungus. That is the 3 times table. You have 3 separate lots of fruit, and each lot has 7 pieces. 3 sevens are 21. Can't you see that, you stagnant cesspool? I'll give you one more chance. I have 8 coconuts, 8 monkey nuts, and 80 nutty little idiots like you. How many nuts do I have altogether? Answer me quickly. Poor Wilfred was profusely flustered. Wait, he cried. Please wait. I've got to add up 8 coconuts and 8 monkey nuts. He started counting on his fingers. You bursting blister, yelled the Trunchbull. You moth-eaten maggot, this is not adding up. This is multiplication. The answer is 3/8. Or is it 8 threes? What's the difference between 3/8 and 8 threes? Tell me that, you managed little Wurzel, and look sharp about it. By now, Wilfred was far too frightened and bewildered even to speak. In 2 strides, the Trunchbull was beside him, and by some amazing gymnastic trick, it may have been judo or karate, she flipped the back of Wilfred's legs and one of her feet so that the boy shot up off the ground and turned a somersault in the air. But halfway through the somersault, she caught him by an ankle and held him dangling upside down like a plucked chicken in a shop window. 8 threes, the Trunchbull shouted, swinging Wilfred from side to side by his ankle. 8 threes is the same as 3 eights, and 3 eights are 24. Repeat that. At exactly that moment, Nigel, at the other end of the room, jumped to his feet and started pointing excitedly at the blackboard and screaming, "The chalk! The chalk! Look at the chalk! It's moving all on its own!" So hysterical and shrill was Nigel's scream that everyone in the place, including the Trunchbull, looked up at the blackboard, and there, sure enough, a brand new piece of chalk was hovering near the gray-black writing surface of the blackboard. "It's writing something!" screamed Nigel. "The chalk is writing something!" And indeed it was. Agatha. Agatha. "What the blazes is this?" yelled the Trunchbull. It had shaken her to see her own first name being written like that by an invisible hand. She dropped Wilfred on the floor. Then she yelled at nobody in particular, "Who's doing this? Who's writing it?" The chalk continued to write, "Agatha, this is Magnus. This is Magnus." Everyone in the place heard the gasps that came from the Trunchbull's throat. "No!" she cried. "It can't be! It can't be Magnus!" "It is Magnus, and you'd better believe it." Miss Honey, at the side of the room, glanced swiftly at Matilda. The child was sitting very straight at her desk, the head held high, the mouth compressed, the eyes glittering like 2 stars. "Agatha, give my Jenny back her house." For some reason, everyone now looked at the Trunchbull. The woman's face had turned white as snow, and her mouth was opening and shutting like a halibut out of water, and giving out a series of strangled gasps. "Give my Jenny her wages. Give my Jenny the house. Then get out of here. If you don't, I will come and get you. I will come and get you like you got me. I am watching you, Agatha." The chalk stopped writing. It hovered for a few moments. Then suddenly it dropped to the floor with a tinkle and broke in 2. Wilfred, who had managed to resume his seat in the front row, screamed, "Miss Trunchbull has fallen down! Miss Trunchbull is on the floor!" This was the most sensational bit of news of all, and the entire class jumped up out of their seats to have a really good look. And there she was, the huge figure of the headmistress, stretched full length on her back across the floor, out for the count. Miss Honey ran forward and knelt beside the prostrate giant. "She's fainted," she cried. "She's out cold. Someone go and fetch the matron at once." 3 children ran out of the room. Nigel, always ready for action, leapt up and seized the big jug of water. "My father says cold water is the best way to wake up someone who's fainted," he said, and with that he tipped the entire contents of the jug over the Trunchbull's head. No one, not even Miss Honey, protested. As for Matilda, she continued to sit motionless at her desk. She was feeling curiously elated. She felt as though she had touched something that was not quite of this world, the highest point of the heavens, the farthest star. She had felt most wonderfully the power surging up behind her eyes, gushing like a warm fluid inside her skull, and her eyes had become scorching hot, hotter than ever before, and things had come bursting out of her eye sockets, and then the piece of chalk had lifted itself up and had begun to write. It seemed as though she had hardly done anything. It had all been so simple. The school matron, followed by 5 teachers, 3 women, and 2 men, came rushing into the room. "By golly, somebody's floored her at last," cried one of the men, grinning. "Congratulations, Miss Honey." "Who threw the water over her?" asked the matron. "I did," said Nigel proudly. "Good for you." another teacher said. Shall we get some more? Stop that, the matron said. We must carry her up to the sick room. It took all 5 teachers and the matron to lift the enormous woman and stagger with her out of the room. Miss Honey said to the class, I think you'd all better go out to the playground and amuse yourselves until the next lesson. Then she turned and walked over to the chalkboard and carefully wiped out all the chalk writing. The children began filing out of the classroom. Matilda started to go with them, but as she passed Miss Honey, she paused, and her twinkling eyes met the teacher's eyes, and Miss Honey ran forward and gave the tiny child a great big hug and a kiss. A new home. Later that day, the news began to spread that the headmistress had recovered from her fainting fit and had then marched out of the school building, tight-lipped and white in the face. The next morning, she did not turn up at school. At lunchtime, Mr. Trilby, the deputy head, telephoned her house to inquire if she was feeling unwell. There was no answer on the phone. When school was over, Mr. Trilby decided to investigate further, so he walked to the house where Miss Trunchbull lived, on the edge of the village, the lovely small red brick Georgian building known as the Red House, tucked away in the woods behind the hills. He rang the bell. No answer. He knocked loudly. No answer. He called out, Is anybody at home? No answer. He tried the door and to his surprise found it unlocked. He went in. The house was silent and there was no one in it, and yet all the furniture was still in place. Mr. Trilby went upstairs to the main bedroom. Here, also, everything seemed to be normal until he started opening drawers and looking into cupboards. There were no clothes or underclothes or shoes anywhere. They had all gone. She's done a bunk, Mr. Trilby said to himself, and he went away to inform the school governors that the headmistress had apparently vanished. On the second morning, Miss Honey received by registered post a letter from a firm of local solicitors informing her that the last will and testament of her late father, Dr. Honey, had suddenly and very mysteriously turned up. This document revealed that ever since her father's death, Miss Honey had in fact been the rightful owner of the property on the edge of the village known as the Red House, which until recently had been occupied by a Miss Agatha Trunchbull. The will also showed that her father's lifetime savings, which fortunately were still safely in the bank, had also been left to her. The solicitor's letter added that if Miss Honey would kindly call into the office as soon as possible, then the property and the money could be transferred into her name very rapidly. Miss Honey did just that, and within a couple of weeks she had moved into the Red House, the very place in which she had been brought up and where luckily all the family furniture and pictures were still around. From then on, Matilda was a welcome visitor to the Red House every single evening after school, and a very close friendship began to develop between the teacher and the small child. Back at home, great changes were also taking place. As soon as it became clear that Miss Trunchbull had completely disappeared from the scene, the excellent Mr. Trilby was appointed head teacher in her place, and very soon after that, Matilda was moved up into the top form, where Miss Plimsoll quickly discovered that this amazing child was every bit as bright as Miss Honey had said. One evening, a few weeks later, Matilda was having tea with Miss Honey in the kitchen of the Red House after school, as they always did, when Matilda said suddenly, Something strange has happened to me, Miss Honey. Tell me about it, Miss Honey said. This morning, Matilda said, just for fun, I tried to push something over with my eyes, and I couldn't do it. Nothing moved. I didn't even feel the hotness building up behind my eyeballs. The power had gone. I think I've lost it completely. Miss Honey carefully buttered a slice of brown bread and put a little strawberry jam on it. I've been expecting something like this to happen, she said. You have? Why? Matilda asked. Well, Miss Honey said, it's only a guess, but here's what I think. While you were in my class, you had nothing to do, nothing to make you struggle. Your fairly enormous brain was going crazy with frustration. It was bubbling and boiling away like mad inside your head. There was tremendous energy bottled up in there with nowhere to go. And somehow or other, you were able to shoot that energy out through your eyes and make objects move. But now things are different. You're in the top form competing against children more than twice your age, and all that mental energy is being used up in class. Your brain is for the first time having to struggle and strive and keep really busy, which is great. That's only a theory, mind you, and it may be a silly one, but I don't think it's far off from the mark. I'm glad it happened, Matilda said. I wouldn't want to go through life as a miracle worker. You've done enough, Miss Honey said. I can still hardly believe you made all this happen for me. Matilda, who was perched on a tall stool at the kitchen table, ate her bread and jam slowly. She did so love these afternoons with Miss Honey. She felt completely comfortable in her presence, and the two of them talked to each other more or less as equals. Did you know, Matilda said suddenly, that the heart of a mouse beats at the rate of 650 times a minute? I did not, Miss Honey said, smiling. How absolutely fascinating. Where did you read that? In a book from the library, Matilda said. And that means it goes so fast you can't even hear the separate beats. It must sound just like a little buzz. It must, Miss Honey said. And how fast do you think a hedgehog's heart beats? Matilda asked. Tell me, Miss Honey said, smiling again. It's not as fast as a mouse, Matilda said. It's 300 times a minute. But even so, you wouldn't have thought it went as fast as that in a creature that moves so slowly, would you, Miss Honey? I certainly wouldn't, Miss Honey said. Tell me one more. A horse, Matilda said. That's really slow. It's only 40 times a minute. This child, Miss Honey told herself, seems to be interested in everything. When one is with her, it's impossible to be bored. I love it. The two of them stayed sitting and talking in the kitchen for an hour or so longer, and then at about 6 o'clock Matilda said good night and set out to walk home to her parents' house, which was about an 8-minute journey away. When she arrived at her own gate, she saw a large black Mercedes motor car parked outside. She didn't take too much notice of that. There were often strange cars parked outside her father's place, but when she entered the house, she was confronted by a scene of utter chaos. Her mother and father were both in the hall, frantically stuffing clothing and various objects into suitcases. What on earth's going on? She cried. What's happening, Daddy? We're off, Mr. Wormwood said, not looking up. We're leaving toward the airport in half an hour, so you'd better get packed. Your brother's upstairs all ready to go. Get a move on it, girl. We'll get going. Off? Matilda cried. Where to? Spain, the father said. It's a better climate than this. Lousy country. Spain? Matilda cried. I don't want to go to Spain. I love it here, and I love my school. Just do as you're told, and stop arguing, the father snapped. I've got enough trouble without messing about with you. But, Daddy, Matilda cried. Shut up, the father shouted. We're leaving in 30 minutes. I'm not missing that plane. But how long for, Daddy? Matilda cried. When are we coming back? We aren't, the father said. Now beat it. I'm busy. Matilda turned away from him and walked out through the open front door. As soon as she was on the road, she began to run. She headed straight back toward Miss Honey's house, and she reached it in less than 4 minutes. She flew up the drive, and suddenly she saw Miss Honey in the front garden, standing in the middle of a bed of roses, doing something with a pair of clippers. Miss Honey had heard the sound of Matilda's feet racing over the gravel, and now she straightened up and turned and stepped out of the rose bed as the child came running up. My, she said, what in the world is the matter? Matilda stood before her, panting out of breath, her small face flushed crimson all over. They're leaving, she cried. They're all gone mad. They've all gone mad, and they're filling their suitcases, and they're leaving for Spain in about 30 minutes. Who is? Miss Honey asked quietly. Mommy and Daddy and my brother Mike, and they say I've got to go with them. You mean for holiday? Miss Honey asked. Forever, Matilda cried. Daddy said we're never coming back. There was a brief silence. Then Miss Honey said, Actually, I'm not very surprised. You mean you knew they were going? Matilda cried. Why didn't you tell me? No, darling, Miss Honey said. I did not know they were going, but the news still doesn't surprise me. Why? Matilda asked. Please tell me why. She was still out of breath from the running and from the shock of it all. Because your father, Miss Honey said, is in with a bunch of crooks. Everyone in the village knows that. My guess is that he is a receiver of stolen cars from all over the country. He's in it deep. Matilda stared at her, open-mouthed. Miss Honey went on. People brought stolen cars to your father's workshop, where he changed the number plates and resprayed the bodies a different color and all the rest of it. And now somebody's probably tipped off that the police are onto him, and he's doing what they all do, running off to Spain where they can't get him. He'll have been sending all his money out there for years, all ready and waiting for him to arrive. They were standing on the lawn in front of the lovely red brick house with its weathered old red tiles and its tall chimneys, and Miss Honey still had the pair of garden clippers in one hand. It was a warm golden evening, and a blackbird was singing somewhere nearby. I don't want to go with them, Matilda shouted suddenly. I won't go with them. I'm afraid you must, Miss Honey said. I want to live here with you, Matilda cried out. Please, let me live here with you. I only wish you could, Miss Honey said, but I'm afraid it's impossible. You cannot leave your parents just because you want to. They have a right to take you with them. But what if they agreed? Matilda cried eagerly. What if they said yes? I can stay with you. Would you let me stay with you then? Miss Honey said softly, Yes, that would be heaven. Well, I think they might, Matilda cried. I honestly think they might. They don't actually care tuppence about me. Not so fast, Miss Honey said. We've got to go fast, Matilda cried. They're leaving any moment. Come on, she shouted, grasping Miss Honey's hand. Please come with me and ask them. But we'll have to hurry. We'll have to run. The next moment, the two of them were running down the drive together and then out to the road, and Matilda was ahead, pulling Miss Honey after her by the wrist, and it was a wild and wonderful dash. They came along the country lane and through the village to the house where Matilda's parents lived. The big black Mercedes was still outside, and now its boot and all its doors were open, and Mr. Wormwood and the brother were scurrying around it like ants piling in the suitcases, as Matilda and Miss Honey came dashing up. Daddy and Mummy, Matilda burst out, gasping for breath. I don't want to go with you. I want to stay here and live with Miss Honey, and she says that I can, but only if you give me permission. Please say yes. Go on, Daddy, say yes. Say yes, Mummy. The father turned and looked at Miss Honey. You're that teacher woman who once came here to see me, aren't you? He said. Then he went back to stowing the suitcases into the car. His wife said to him, This one will have to go on the back seat. There's no more room in the boot. I would love to have Matilda, Miss Honey said. I would look after her with loving care, Mr. Wormwood, and I would pay for everything. She wouldn't cost you a penny. But it was not my idea. It was Matilda's, and I will not agree to take her without your full and willing consent. Come on, Harry, the mother said, pushing a suitcase into the back seat. Why don't you let her go, if that's what she wants? It'll be one less to look after. I'm in a hurry, the father said. I've got a plane to catch. If she wants to stay, let her stay. It's fine with me. Matilda leapt into Miss Honey's arms and hugged her, and Miss Honey hugged her back, and then the mother and father and brother were inside the car, and the car was pulling away with the tires screaming. The brother gave a wave through the rear window, but the other two didn't even look back. Miss Honey was still hugging the tiny girl in her arms, and neither of them said a word as they stood there watching the big black car tearing round the corner at the end of the road and disappearing forever into the distance.